This video is brought to you by my fantastic supporters over at Patreon. Go to patreon.com/TJTheEmperor to find out how you can support the channel.
And now, our feature presentation.
So, I'm going to start by sharing an opinion that's probably a little bit controversial. Shinichiro Watanabe? He's a pretty good director. Obviously, that was a joke. I don't think there's a single anime director that's so universally beloved here in the West. The only ones who are anywhere close to Watanabe's level are probably Hayao Miyazaki and Satoshi Kon. Watching Cowboy Bebop on Adult Swim has been a rite of passage for generations of American anime fans, myself included, since it premiered there in 2001. And it's not just Cowboy Bebop either. Samurai Champloo, Macross Plus, Space Dandy. Watanabe is one of those chosen few anime directors who I'll argue has never directed anything bad or even mediocre in his entire career. He's a genuine master of his craft. Now, the reasons for Watanabe's stratospheric position in the anime director pantheon could be the subject of its own video, but taking even just a cursory glance through his creative output yields some pretty obvious answers. There's his tendency to frame his work, both tonally and atmospherically, around a specific genre of music, always with a powerful soundtrack accompaniment. There's the fact that his protagonists are often larger-than-life personalities who demand our attention. There's his consistent use of dynamic, over-the-top animation, perhaps to complement those larger-than-life characters. There's the complete tonal roller coaster ride his shows take us on, where episodes often shift from rip-roaringly hilarious to profoundly depressing on a dime, and how he somehow makes these changes feel convincing where so many others would fail. Clearly, there's a lot to admire in his filmography, but what if I were to tell you that one of his greatest works is something that features exactly none of those things? The work I'm talking about is Baby Blue, a short film Watanabe directed in 2007 as his contribution to the anthology movie Genius Party. If you've never heard of Baby Blue, I don't blame you. It's never been very well known, and this lack of attention can probably be entirely blamed on its inclusion in that anthology. Though Genius Party came out in 2007, it was not given an official American release until G-Kids, bless their hearts, released it on Blu-ray in 2019, an entire 12 years after its release in Japan. The movie was fan-subbed shortly after its 2007 debut, but even then, it failed to make a lasting impact, and I have a fairly decent guess as to why. The anthology films that have historically done well overseas can be broken down into one of two broad categories. The first consists of those that are based off of an already successful intellectual property. The Matrix and Batman Gotham Knight are the obvious examples here. The second are those that have some superstar creator acting as overseer. The most notable example in this category is probably Memories, which was overseen and was based on works by Akira creator Katsuhiro Otomo. Genius Party falls into neither of those two camps. Studio 4 Degrees Celsius, the ones in charge of the project, basically told its directors to make whatever they wanted, so there's no unifying theme here whatsoever, previously established intellectual property or otherwise. Furthermore, the directors they chose, as is typical with so many anthology projects, were not mainstream names. Aside from Watanabe, and perhaps Shoji Kawamori if you're a fan of old-school robot shows, the directors of Genius Party would only be considered big names if you're real animation nerds. Guys like Koji Morimoto, Mahiro Maeda, and Masaaki Yuasa. Yeah, Masaaki Yuasa may be a lot more well-known overseas now, but in 2007 it was a totally different story. Hell, he was barely well-known in his home country at that point. All this to say, Genius Party has never really been given the chance to succeed, and that's a real shame. The sheer variety of work on display is mind-boggling, and while there are a couple of very clear duds in there, I've always found most of the shorts to be highly enjoyable. The movie deserves a lot more success than it's received, so if you haven't, I highly recommend checking out the Blu-ray. Now, a word of warning before I go any further. Since this is a short film, it's kind of impossible to discuss Baby Blue in any sort of depth without talking about it from beginning to end, so spoilers are incoming. If you keep watching, I'm going to assume you've either seen Baby Blue or are planning on watching Baby Blue after my video's done, so just be aware. Alright, let's get into it. The premise of Baby Blue is almost humorously simple. There are really only two characters of note. Sho, a high school student who plays the piano, and his friend Hazuki. One morning before school, Sho approaches Hazuki with a proposal. Just for one day, the two of them should forget about the future, about what's going to happen tomorrow, and just skip school and go do something fun. Turns out Hazuki's down with Sho's idea, and the two of them leave to go on an adventure. And that's basically it. Like I said, humorously simple, you can sum up the premise in a couple of sentences. If you think that sounds wildly out of character for a Shinichiro Watanabe anime, rest assured that you're not alone. Watanabe himself admitted that when he told people he was working on, to use his words, a boy-girl story, nobody he told would believe him. And on the surface, yeah, I totally understand the confusion. But once you look a bit closer, I feel that Baby Blue fits in very well with the rest of Watanabe's oeuvre, and one can easily see what I'm talking about when looking at our main characters, Sho and Hazuki. From the film's opening shot, before we even learn their names, we see there's something going on with both of them. The establishing shots of the school are mostly empty. When we see other students, they're mostly either outside or on their way somewhere else. This gives the impression that Sho and Hazuki are, as contradictory as it may sound, totally isolated despite being surrounded by their peers. The first shots of each character further emphasize their isolation. Hazuki is literally the only person in her classroom, and instead of studying or doing anything academic, she's scribbling on her desk, in permanent marker no less. Sho, meanwhile, is alone in the music room, obviously thinking about everything besides the piece he's supposed to be practicing. The first conversation between the two protagonists serves to further this feeling of discord, for although Hazuki agrees to Sho's adventure, the conversation itself feels stilted and awkward by design. Though the two clearly know each other, it seems like it's been ages since they've had any sort of meaningful interaction, something that's confirmed in the scene immediately following this one. Sho speaks in an overly formal way that Hazuki seems to find off-putting, and yet still seems happy to be asked out on this adventure. Despite this initial awkwardness, the blocking of the scene seems to suggest that something special is waiting for them outside the school's walls. Most of this scene is drearily lit, and tellingly, the rest of the students remain exclusively within those zones of darkness. Only Sho and Hazuki are segregated here, near the natural light of the windows. So much is being suggested here, and the audience is only privy to the very surface. There's a well-known theory of writing developed by Ernest Hemingway called the iceberg theory. I'm sure many of you have probably heard about it in your English classes, but for those that haven't, and for the rest of you who need a refresher, here's a famous description from the master himself. If a writer of prose knows enough of what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. This is an apt description of what Watanabe is doing here, and greater reflection shows us that he's perhaps the greatest student of Hemingway's ideas in the history of anime. I'll use Cowboy Bebop as an example, since most of you probably have, like me, seen that show more times than you can count. There aren't a ton of recurring side characters in that show that the main characters interact with for more than a single episode, but every time they do, for instance when Spike visits Annie or when Jet talks to Bob, you can just feel the years of history between them despite the fact that they may only share the screen for just a few minutes. This kind of character writing is all over Watanabe's filmography, and it's the linchpin holding Baby Blue together. So our two leads start their adventure, and this gives us our first real taste of Baby Blue's spectacular animation. Now, nobody's gonna argue that Baby Blue is any sort of animated tour de force in the way that something like Space Dandy is, but at the same time, there's a real artistry in being able to capture a city in all its vitality, and this is where Baby Blue excels. The attention to detail is such that it feels like you're walking through Tokyo alongside Sho and Hazuki. In that respect, it reminds me much more of the works of Makoto Shinkai than anything Shinichiro Watanabe's done. And since I mentioned his name, I suppose this is as good a time as any to discuss Makoto Shinkai, since while there aren't that many in-depth looks at Baby Blue on the internet, virtually all of them at some point are sure to bring up its similarity to Shinkai's work. Specifically to his film 5 cm per second, which coincidentally also released in 2007. Again, I can see why those comparisons are made, since that film, like Baby Blue, centers on the evolving relationship between two ordinary kids framed across impeccably animated Japanese cityscapes. Hell, it wouldn't surprise me if anyone believed that Baby Blue was made in direct response to Shinkai. That being said, however, I can with relative certainty say that any similarities between Watanabe and Shinkai's films are completely coincidental. First of all, Shinkai's work prior to 5 centimeters per second were sci-fi stories, so Watanabe obviously wasn't drawing from those for inspiration here. Second, Watanabe had been working on Baby Blue since at least the beginning of 2006, well before anyone knew what 5 centimeters per second was even going to be about. Aside from this incompatibility in time, comparing the two films side by side demonstrates that far from one being a response to the other, each should be regarded as a pronounced expression of its director's characteristic themes. Much of Shinkai's work can be defined as examinations of how people maintain their relationships over great distances. 5 centimeters per second examines both the physical distance of separation through space and the metaphysical distance of growing up along different paths. To put it succinctly, the film looks at how, and if, the main characters can sustain their relationship into an uncertain future across those distances. Baby Blue, by contrast, has an almost opposite focus, instead looking at how Sho and Hazuki can rebuild their relationship despite the baggage of their past. This is the defining feature that makes Baby Blue a Watanabe film. You can see this focus all throughout his work. The relationship between Spike, Vicious, and Julia in Cowboy Bebop is by far the most famous example. But even in something like Macross Plus, that entire movie is framed around exactly that premise. Sho and Hazuki's relationship is nowhere near as dramatic as those in Cowboy Bebop and Macross Plus, but it's still just as complex. Again, because of Watanabe's reliance on the iceberg theory, most of this has to remain in the realm of conjecture, but I think we're given more than enough to paint an adequate picture. The only things we're told explicitly are the two were friends in early childhood, where they lived near some sort of military base. At some point, in a particularly reckless display of childhood bravado, the two broke into that base and stole a grenade, which becomes a kind of symbol of their friendship. That's more or less the extent of what we know of their early relationship, and what little we can glean of their past aside from that seems to be from a time when they've already drifted apart. Sho seems to have been put under a lot of academic pressure from his family, and while he maintains the appearance of, as Hazuki calls him, a good boy, deep down he resents that. He definitely has a rebellious side, not just because he's shamelessly skipping school, but also in the fact that he casually mentions he once seriously thought of using their grenade to blow up a teacher's lounge to rid himself of a teacher he hated in middle school. Hazuki, on the other hand, is much more of a cipher, as she never openly talks about herself and feels much more aloof throughout the film. Hell, she barely bats an eye when Sho admits he almost blew up that teacher's lounge. It's suggested, however, that she's at least more openly rebellious than Sho is. So we have a relatively good foundation for what's going on here. Two old friends reconnecting by skipping school. But there's still so much that remains unsaid. Why did Sho all of a sudden ask Hazuki to do this after seemingly ignoring her for what seems like years? Why did he ask her to go along with him on this specific day? Something is obviously going on that Sho, specifically, is not saying. Though to be fair, Hazuki seems perfectly content to just go along for the ride. When we see them on the train, she's just sitting there happily drinking her Starbucks while Sho remains lost in thought. The two of them are on their way to Shonan Beach, where they plan on setting off fireworks and burying their grenade in the sand. Unfortunately, the two end up falling asleep on the train and missing their stop. By the time they wake up, they're at the end of the line, and it's too late to take the train all the way back to Tokyo. Instead of staying stuck in the suburbs, they decide to steal a bike and ride it back to the city. What follows is an escalating series of crimes that are almost comical in description. They steal the bike, but shortly thereafter, they're pursued by a bike cop. Without thinking twice, the two begin pedaling as fast as they can to escape. Neither of them are at all fazed by the fact that they're blatantly resisting a police officer. Hell, they eventually kick the bastard into a bush before riding onto the expressway. The only thing in the world that feels important right now is that they see their adventure through to the end. Nothing else in the world should try to stop them. Unfortunately, something in fact does try to stop them, this time in the form of a group of thugs who want nothing more than to have their way with Hazuki. Sho decides to have their little crime spree go out with a literal bang, as he throws his grenade into their cars, causing a massive explosion. As ridiculous as it sounds, neither Sho nor Hazuki is fazed by this either. They escape the thugs and continue their journey on foot, arriving at the beach at the break of dawn. Though the scene with the grenade may feel like the film's climax, I always felt like this scene, at the beach, quiet as it is the film's crowning achievement from an emotional perspective. Sho reveals that he's moving away tomorrow, and because he's certain that everyone is going to forget about him once he's gone, he decided to ask Hazuki on this adventure. He ends by wishing that the two of them could just disappear somewhere together. Hazuki responds only by saying that, when they were young, she always looked up to him and had a crush on him, but now she has a boyfriend, something that Sho already knows as he's seen the two of them walking together at school. If any scene reveals how brilliant Watanabe is at mastering the iceberg theory, it's this one. Very, very little has actually been said, and yet by the time it ends, we see the whole film in an entirely new light. Hazuki's admission of having a crush on Sho in their childhood seems the key revelation here, as it seems obvious, to me anyway, that she's not just talking about the past anymore. Those feelings never completely went away, even though she's currently in another relationship. That seems to be the core of this entire conversation. These two people telling the other, "I still love you," in every way but directly saying the four words themselves. I find it interesting that, in contrast to basically the entire rest of the film, it's Hazuki who's being more open with her feelings here. Sho spends most of his time rationalizing this adventure they've just been on. In the event some feelings do slip out, such as his fear that he's probably going to be forgotten, it's framed in the context of that rationalization. It's as if he doesn't have to say anything directly because the adventure they had said way more than words could accomplish. That adventure was basically his way of making real his fantasy of disappearing somewhere with Hazuki. Though Sho doesn't admit any romantic feelings towards her, again, I think it's clear that they exist, and the entire movie up to this point is a testament to that idea. With that in mind, the grenade becomes something much greater. Yes, it's still a symbol of their relationship, but we can now see it's become something much more than just that. Their adventure stealing the grenade is the one scene from their past that's portrayed in any detail, and given that Watanabe's work is always extremely selective with regards to what is shown in flashback, I find this to be very telling. We, the audience, are naturally going to wonder what else happened between them back then. Perhaps Watanabe's conscious decision to not tell us is because, whatever else may have happened, it ultimately doesn't matter. It doesn't change the fact that Sho is moving. It doesn't change the fact that Hazuki is in another relationship. These two people have grown far too far apart, and it's far too late to overcome that lost time. The grenade, for Sho, is an embodiment of his relationship with Hazuki in one terrifying weapon. It's a physical memento of their greatest adventure. It's a symbol of his underlying rebelliousness. And on the highway, it becomes a literal manifestation of the anger and frustration he has regarding his inability to make up for that lost time. This inability to regain that time they've lost may be why neither of them actually confesses their feelings. As Hazuki says, there's nowhere to go, ostensibly referring to this current adventure, but said in a way that's most certainly refers to their relationship as a whole. The scene is profoundly sad, but it's not a sadness of the caliber of, say, Grave of the Fireflies. It's instead a quiet melancholy, one that can only occur at the very moment you realize it's too late to fix something you desperately want to change. And so the two of them leave the beach, without even setting off any fireworks, as they had planned. As the train carries them back to Tokyo, Hazuki sits in silence, while Sho stands looking blankly out at the window, neither of them saying anything, neither of them so much as looking at each other. And what more could possibly be said? Hell, Sho doesn't even want Hazuki to see him off when he finally leaves town, though it must be said that Sho isn't entirely capable of cutting her off, as it's revealed that he left her a farewell note in the music room. That evening, Sho departs for his new home, completely sullen and withdrawn. As he looks out the window of the train, he sees something that neither he, nor us in the audience, will never forget. Hazuki, standing to the side of the track, staring at the window, fireworks in her hand. Why it's impossible for us to forget comes down to the fact that Watanabe decided to animate this scene in what seems like 3 or 4 frames per second. This causes the movie to distort our sense of time. A scene that probably should play out in a couple seconds at most lasts for nearly 2 minutes, suggesting an import far greater than its measuring clock time can suggest. For as melancholic as the previous scene was, this last scene counterbalances it with a corresponding sense of hope beyond words. We don't know what's going to happen to Sho and Hazuki after this point. The film ends without telling us, but this one gesture gives us all the reassurance in the world that somehow our two protagonists will find a way to make their relationship work. The fireworks, much like the grenade before it, are another perfect symbol from Watanabe on a number of levels. Remember, the entire reason the two went to the beach in the first place was to set them off, and the fact that they didn't can easily be read as a failure on their part. To end the movie on this visual is not to allow that failure the last word. Further, it's certainly no accident that, after their relationship has heretofore been symbolized by a grenade, the next major phase of that relationship is defined by fireworks. One manifestation of fire has been replaced by another. The key difference, of course, is instead of it being a weapon of mass destruction, it's instead a symbol of celebration. It must be repeated, Watanabe is a master of saying so much with so little, and he doesn't tell us how we're supposed to come away from this scene, but I refuse to believe that he wanted us to leave Baby Blue feeling anything but a sense of hope, a hope that may be impossible to define, but hope nevertheless. Sho and Hazuki may indeed have lost the time from their past, and have come to live in a present that is deeply unsatisfying to both of them, but that doesn't mean that they therefore must be bound to an unbearable future. Even in the darkest of nights, it's still possible to be a light that blinds, and as long as that light exists, no future, no matter how undefined, is entirely out of reach.